All right, so today happened to be our one day a month that we film, and got the news that Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader in Russia, has died in prison, and wanted to give some extemporaneous thoughts on this, and specifically how it applies to Nomad Capitalist. Obviously, very unfortunate. I know that I know people from Russia and from that part of the world who are big supporters of his and believe that he had the ability to enact some real change at some point. But I wanted to talk about that. It's a very hard subject because, to me, I left the United States a long time ago. When I lived in the United States, since I was 15 or 16 years old, I was not a particularly patriotic person. I always saw the U.S. for some of the nasty stuff that it does around the world, and ultimately I decided I didn't want to be associated with that. And you see when you have that mindset and you travel around, you see that the people they tell you are the bad guys, maybe bad guys in some ways and not in others. You see the people they tell you the good guys aren't the good guys. I'm not saying Alexei Navalny. I only know of him as a good guy. And yet, if you're Edward Snowden, you're happy that Russia's there, and you're happy that Russia's against the West, as I'm sure some other Western dissidents who had found refuge in Russia over the years felt. Doesn't mean that Russia, the political system there, is wonderful, but it means that the idea that for certain people there's not a benefit, there has to be some nuance. But on Alexei Navalny, the story from Al Jazeera, leaders are saying he was brutally murdered, paid for his courage with his life. Leaders around the world are saying they hold Russia responsible for his death. The story is that Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has died after collapsing and losing consciousness in the remote penal colony north of the Arctic Circle. He was serving a long sentence. The Kremlin spokesperson, said that Vladimir Putin was briefed on this, a fierce critic of the president. And basically, it seems that he was out for a walk and just lost consciousness and could not be resuscitated. Now, of course, the Russian Foreign Ministry and their spokespeople are saying that the West has already arrived at conclusions without forensic evidence. Political opponents should not be jailed. What makes it a little hard for me, and people say, oh, well, this is not a pro-Russia statement. I don't think that some of the Western countries are quite as innocent as they make themselves out to be, but that's no excuse for what would happen in Russia. But for me, I remember when Alexei Navalny went back to Russia a number of years ago. It was a discussion my wife and I had. And I said to myself, that will not end well. And she said, well, he believes in the country and he's going to fight for it. And, hey, that's what he wants to do. I look at this through the lens of go where you're treated best. And obviously the guy extremely courageous, whatever you believe. It's courageous to pretty much know you're going to go to jail and to go back. I wonder if he thought, hey, people will fight for him. There's enough people who love him and support him that they will cause a stir and get him let out. Obviously, that didn't happen. So no doubt, you have to call it courageous. And yet, I look at it and say, what's the goal? That's a question I always ask myself. What's the goal of doing certain things? If the goal is to have the biggest impact and to bring the greatest, he would say, hey, he's against Putin, says the country's corrupt. Certainly, people in the West, in large part, believe that. But what is, which is more beneficial? Which is more impactful? Staying in the West, being a bullhorn for what you perceive as the issues in Russia, bringing attention to it, lobbying people around the world. I mean, listen, that may not have an impact. Activism doesn't always have an immediate impact or a substantial impact. Sometimes, bad stuff just happens and activism doesn't stop it. Would that have a bigger impact, or would going back to Russia, being sent to prison, and unfortunately dying there, does that have a bigger impact? Now, listen, maybe this has a bigger impact, and maybe that's something that Alexei Navalny calculated and said, listen, maybe his conditions, maybe his death leads to whatever may come next. Now, we've seen since the Russia-Ukraine war, I don't think I mean, for good or bad, whichever you believe, that some of these sanctions have necessarily hurt Russia as much as the Western governments thought they did. In fact, there were some things where they're now kind of changing the law in the U.S. Because they realized some of the stuff was going to backfire on them. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but you're seeing, and there's been a number of news stories recently about all these kind of third countries. I mean, Russian trade with Kyrgyzstan is through the roof since the war. I mean, we all know what's happening there with Cyprus, with the UAE. I mean, you're seeing Russian oil being sold through these places and being shipped to the rest of the world in violation of some of the sanctions, but it's happening. And so, even the IMF has said, is Russia really suffering as badly as they were expected to from the sanctions? If you live in the West, if you live in the East, you're probably seeing this through your own lens. Oh, he's pro-Russia. Oh, he's anti-Russia. I'm not trying to take a geopolitical stance here. Obviously, the Alexei Navalny thing is very sad. But my question is very simple, and why I have the philosophy that I do. I wonder, he's a guy who's 47 years old. Would he have a bigger impact for the years that he was jailed and for potentially the next 40 years of his life if nobody got to him? It poisoned him. Would there be a bigger impact of being a bullhorn? And you look at some of the opposition leaders, for example, from Belarus and other countries who are in exile, and they continue to speak out, and they continue to lobby, and they continue to push for policy. Now, you can argue how effective that policy is. You can argue how effective each person would be at bringing it. But for me, this is the more selfless side of go where you're treated best. We're all here to have an impact. Again, I don't want to belittle the courage of Mr. Navalny for doing what he thought was best, and maybe he's a step ahead of me and thinking, hey, this is actually what will have the greatest impact, and he was willing to sacrifice himself. I certainly wouldn't be surprised by that. But for me, I think that for most of us, the biggest impact comes from being able to consistently beat the drum for our cause. I know that for me, the longer I sit here doing this, more people see the message and people come up to me all around the world. We have people who work here who have friends all around the world. I mean, all continents, all corners of the world who have been inspired in some way by what we do here. And I, personally think, if I just, look at, Peter Schiff's father, who, talked to, I don't know the whole facts of the case, but they say, was helping people not pay their taxes. And went to jail. I believe died in jail. Was that more impactful in spreading the message? I don't want to compare myself to anybody here. I think that, staying free, staying as a voice, staying as an advocate, staying as an activist for a cause. I'm not talking about Alexei Navalny because I think that, maybe that's a special case and maybe he was willing for this to be the result. Maybe this is his contribution. I wanted to be clear that I think that's a very courageous thing and I respect that. But for the rest of us who look at this and say, oh yeah, well that's why you should go to your country, you should fight, you should struggle. I don't think that if we all did that, the impact would be as serious and as significant as being voices in places where that was free. I just don't. And I think that for most people, when the rubber meets the road, that's the choice that they'll take. And so a very unfortunate event today, and one that hopefully we can use to evaluate what our impact is and how we want to make that impact.